Hello, everyone. Can you hear me and can you see actually the slides? Okay, perfect. So I'm really grateful to the organizers for having invited me. And I'm going to talk today about aging and bilingualism. And it's also very, very important for India, for the Indian reality. As you see on my map, linguistic diversity is almost highest in India, so it's of uttermost interest to you. So I always like to put next after this map about language diversity, this slide here about the epidemiology of neurodegenerative diseases like dementia. And if we compare them, there is a certain kind of overlap. Like you see, diversity is highest in India, and dementia rate as compared to Western countries is lower in India. Okay, so that's and not only for India but for many other countries. Unfortunately, we don't have epidemiological data for the countries you see in gray on the picture. So there seems to be a connection. Okay, and I go a step back and we'll discuss where did all this story started, bilingualism and aging. It started, I would say, 20 years ago, even a little bit more, with the observation, studies done in the 90s, in the 2000s, that bilinguals are a little bit faster on some executive functioning tasks, like the assignment task, the flanker task, and Stroop task, and many others. They all have in common that we have to resolve some cognitive conflicts. And then the observation was in different populations, like children, adults, young adults, elderly adults, that bilinguals are faster. And the interesting thing is that the difference in milliseconds between the decision-making process is became higher, so increasing with increasing age. Okay, and I have also to say that in the last 10 years, there were many other studies, especially in children and in young adults, who have not anymore confirmed this, I would say, beneficial effect of bilingualism upon executive functions. But we still observe it in the elderly population. There was a very nice keynote article about this specific fact published 5 years ago in our journal by Virginia Valiant, who claimed that nowadays, as compared to 20, 30 years ago, young children and young adults are much more exposed to other cognitively stimulating activities. Most of our cell phone, we are all multitasking and also on. So potentially, by being exposed to all these other activities, the effects of bilingualism would become masked. But in the elderly population who are not so much exposed to other stimulating activities, the effect of bilingualism is not masked and it's most prominent. And there you see it still today. My first premise is always to make clear that there is no one-to-one relationship between behavior and brain. Of course, there is a relationship. Without brain, there's no behavior, and probably even the other way around. But it's always important to underline that the relationship is not one-to-one. Look at the slide. It's a very simple task in which the subject has to decide if the number 3 is smaller or bigger than the number 5. Okay, how does it happen in our brain? The first step is the message is through the visual system, comes to the occipital cortex. Then it goes forward to the inferior parietal lobule, where number comparison is usually carried out, and then it goes forward to the motor areas with which I can press the button and give my decision. Okay, and you see all the time in milliseconds we need to do this. In average, I would say 600-700 milliseconds we need, and those are the brain areas. But if now my reaction time to this would be 600 milliseconds, and also Professor Mishra does the same, 600 milliseconds. It does not mean that we both use the brain to the same degree. Maybe he activates less than me. And in cognition, it would mean that he is smarter than me. He does this task with less neural resources, so it's less effortful for him. Okay, and this is something we always have to keep in mind. And even in the other way, maybe I do it in 600 milliseconds and he does it in 800 milliseconds. So I'm faster, but we activate the same areas. Okay, this also happens. So we always have to keep this in mind. And one of the most important brain structures in psychometrics for decision making is the anterior cingulate cortex, which you see here in green. Okay, and these are some results of a study of ours we've done on a bilingual group in Italy, in northern Italy, South Tyrol, which is a bilingual region. The first language is German, the second language is English, and we compared them to a group of monolinguals from Milan, where I am actually based. And they had to do the flanker task, which you see down here. The flanker task, you all know how it works. There's a central arrow, and the subject has to keep attention if the flanking arrows point in the same, if the central arrow points in the same direction of the others, or in a different direction. If it points in the same direction, it's a congruent trial. If it points in the other direction, it's an incongruent trial. And if I subtract from the incongruent trials the congruent ones, I have the so-called conflict effect. And in our subjects, this effect, the conflict effect, correlated with gray matter density in the anterior cingulate cortex. You see it here, in the sense that the faster you are on this task, your reaction times, the more gray matter you have in the brain. Okay, and this correlation was significant only for bilinguals. Okay. In this very same study, I must mention we had two distinct runs of the flanker task. Okay, each run had 96 trials, so I could have published the whole work, the behavioral work of this big paper only with one run. It would be sufficient, and this is what my results would have been if I compare the first run in bilinguals in red to the first run of the flanker task of monolinguals in blue here. There was no significant difference. Okay, so my conclusion would be behaviorally they're the same. But if you now look at the brain of our subjects, bilinguals and monolinguals, in order to have the same performance, monolinguals have to activate much more in their anterior cingulate cortex as compared to bilinguals. And if I observe now the second run of the flanker task, bilinguals became much more faster, so they're probably adapting much better to conflicting situations, while monolinguals do not. And in the brain, it's getting even more interesting. Monolinguals are trying to recruit even more brain areas, brain activity, while bilinguals, it seems even less. You can see it here if you extract the signal out of these areas. So they adapt better to conflicting situations. But I always like to show this slide in order to make clear that behavior versus brain is not always the same. It's not a one-to-one relationship. Okay, there is a relationship. It's very important. We always have to investigate it, but it's not a one-to-one relationship. Okay. Now we come to aging. Okay, aging, we have to keep in mind the whole world is aging. It's actually the real pandemic of our century. And why are we growing older? Because the discoveries in medicine actually we can treat many diseases, so we get really older. But with aging, there comes also some risks like cognitive decline. Okay. And the usual trajectory would be like this. You see age and function, that at a certain point, some cognitive functions go down. And subjects usually have what we call a mild cognitive impairment, okay? There's a cognitive test. It's called mini mental state examination. It lasts 5 to 10 minutes. And the maximum score is 30. If your score is below 27, but higher than 23, you have a mild cognitive impairment. If it goes below 23, then we are moving towards what we call mild dementia or severe dementia. It depends on the score. Okay, and it's always good to keep in mind that more than 50% of individuals, of elderly people with mild cognitive impairment remain like this, while the other half usually progresses towards full-blown dementia. And we all also know that the brain is relatively well conserved or preserved up to the age of 60, 65. After this age, the brain volumes will decrease, which in medicine we call brain atrophy. And we will see later during my presentation that that humans have a certain capacity of compensating against the loss of brain volumes. The decrease of brain volume, the trajectories are a little bit different between gray matter, which you see here, and white matter. Like the decrease of gray matter is actually very, very linear with age, while for white matter it is not linear. It's, as you see, a curve. And if I calculate the ratio between gray matter and white matter, it actually seems that gray matter will increase with age, but it's actually an artifact because the decrease of white matter is more profound than of gray matter. But if you keep in mind, gray matter are cells, are neurons, and then the supporting cells and so on, while white matter are the fibers which have to connect the brain. So it seems that with age, our brain becomes disconnected, okay? Because white matter is, the loss of white matter is more profound than the loss of gray matter. Okay, that's when people say, oh, you seem disconnected, but this is exactly what we're talking about in aging. So one approach against cognitive decline in aging should be to connect the neurons better. There are some protective factors which help against cognitive decline to prolong the phase in which subjects are still healthy and functionally working well. Among these factors are education, the years of education, they correlate very well. Your occupation, if you're doing a very intellectual activity, you usually cope better with dementia onset, and many other social, physical, and cognitive activities. And in order to show it very clear, in this graph, you have two different persons. One with a very low cognitive reserve in yellow, the yellow line, and someone with a very high reserve, okay? And the interesting thing is the person with low reserve comes earlier to a breaking point from which then the way is straight towards dementia, okay? But then the progression is very slow. The person with a high cognitive reserve comes much later to the change point, to the breaking point. But once he reaches the breaking point, the progression is very, very fast, okay? And from this, we may already understand a little bit, but we will see much better during my presentation that probably there is already brain atrophy in this phase here, but because of the high cognitive reserve, the person may compensate better. So there are no clinical signs because the brain can compensate that better. But once there's this breaking point, the compensation mechanism will vanish, and you have the clinical manifestations of a full-blown dementia. Okay. So when we talk about reserve capacity, we always have to differentiate very well between what is cognitive reserve and what is brain reserve. Okay, cognitive reserve is actually brain functioning, the ability of the brain to compensate the loss. Okay, while brain reserve happens during our life, actually starting from 20, 30 years old, and it goes towards the aging population. It's because we're doing maybe some activities which increases brain structure, okay? And this increase of brain structure will render our brain more stronger, more consolidated against the onset of dementia. And before we go into bilingualism in detail, I just briefly show you some well-known models in the field of how the brain copes with aging. Okay, I'm not talking necessarily about dementia or cognitive decline, but also healthy aging. Okay, one of the most prominent models is this PASA model, which stands for posterior to anterior shift in aging, which means that for some cognitive functions, which are typically carried out in posterior brain regions, elderly subjects would use more anterior areas, as you see in this graph. Okay, you can see here young and old. Okay, so there will be a shift. Okay, so we probably, elderly people, need more help from anterior regions to do the same. Another very important model is the Herald model. Herald stands for hemispheric asymmetry reduction in older adults. Okay, and put simply, it stands that if there's a typical brain function that is carried out by the left hemisphere, like all language functions, which we here in this graph, verbal working memory would be typical. During aging, our elderly subjects, they would not anymore rely on the left hemisphere, but would use also the right hemisphere in order to compensate what is not anymore present in the left hemisphere. And vice versa, typical cognitive functions which are usually carried out by the right hemisphere, like all visuospatial functions in elderly people, entail also activity in the left hemisphere. Okay, in order to compensate what's not anymore present in the right hemisphere. And if I put those two models together, I would have this picture here. So with aging, I'm using more bilateral activity and more anterior activity in order to compensate loss of neurons, loss of cells. Very, very recently, 2 years ago, De Monet and colleagues published this model. It's called LARA model. It's specific to language. It's a little bit different, like what we have seen just before. LARA stands for lexical access and retrieval in aging, in which some typical language-specific functions, which are carried out mostly in Broca's area or more anteriorly, Botman areas 47 for finding like words, would need also some more posterior activity. So there would be an anterior-posterior shift. And for some domain general activities important for language, the elderly brain would not necessarily use left hemispheric areas, but also of the other hemisphere. So very similar to the Herald model. So it's very important to keep all these models in mind in order also to explain what happens in the bilingual brain. Okay. This is also very, very important in order to understand why bilingualism is so important. What kind of interventions do we have for dealing with cognitive decline and dementia in particular? I must honestly tell you, all what you see on the right side, pharmacological approaches, is very, very disappointing. There is no real medicine we have. Okay, of course there are some drugs, some medicaments like donepezil, rivastatin, and all and so on. They mostly work in increasing the concentration of acetylcholine in the human brain, which is the most important neurotransmitter for memory, for all the memory circuits. But they only work in the very early initial phases of Alzheimer's disease, and to the best of our knowledge, they could eventually slow down the progression by 3 to 6 months, okay, and not more. And on the other hand, we have non-pharmacological approaches, which are strikingly much more promising than the pharmacological approaches. We have cognitive training, which is the most used one, like doing exercises, stimulate, and they can delay stop to a certain degree dementia progression. We have physical exercise. We have very, very innovative methods which goes under the name non-invasive brain stimulation, like transmagnetic transcranial magnetic stimulation on the brain, and even TBCS, which is the electric version. It's less invasive, and also there are some good results in the literature. And as an example, physical exercise, there's a strong point why I'm showing always the physical exercise as an example, because everyone agrees on this, to recommend to our patients or to our elderly population to do some physical exercise. It's healthy for the brain. There are also some nice studies showing that if above the age of 70, if you do 3 times a week, 25 to 30 minutes of physical exercise, dementia onset will be postponed by up to 9 months. Okay. The first study is by G and colleagues from China. They studied 25 subjects over the age of 60. They had to do a dance training in a period of 6 weeks, and they did a fMRI scan before and after the dance training. So it was a functional investigation, and the output measures were cognition, gait speed, and mood state. And as you see, okay, here below you see the activity calculated as bars, okay, of motor processes and of the cerebellum, okay, and they all increase post-exercise. But what is most important to us who study cognition is actually the increase of cognitive functions with only 6 weeks. Okay, the same group did another study, this structural imaging, this time with, funnily enough, with the Nintendo Wii fitness program, which you can easily do at home. And in this study, because again, the duration was 6 weeks, but they had also a control group, which did no intervention at all. And this is very, very interesting that that only after 6 weeks you see plastic structural changes in the brain of the aging population, like increase in the left striatum, in the precuneus, and mostly in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex bilaterally. So gray matter increased. I must also explain very briefly, gray matter increase does not mean that you have now more neurons, okay? Because we all know that there is no way increasing the number of neurons. The number of neurons is already predetermined at birth. But gray matter increase usually means that there are more synapses, more connection between neurons, or that the number of supporting cells increases to bring nutrients to the neurons. Okay, so this slide is very important. As I told you, no one puts into discussion all other factors known for increasing cognitive reserve, like education, occupation, cognitive, and as you've seen, physical and social activities. But when it comes to bilingualism, okay, it's always complicated, because we know now, since I would say 15 years, even more, there have been more than 20 papers from totally independent groups over the world, mostly cross-sectional studies on aging populations, and all these studies, and this is very, very interesting and important, all these studies show that bilinguals come to the diagnosis of dementia with a delay of 4 to 5 years. Okay, and there's also some huge studies done in India. Okay, very, very, very important. But what I want to underline is that there are now more than 20 studies, independent one from the other, all coming to the same conclusion. During aging, if you are bilingual, and especially if you're an active bilingual, but we'll talk about this, dementia onset is delayed by 4 to 5 years. Okay, what does it mean? It means that for public health systems, the money we would save goes into trillions. Okay, because it's really, really expensive, the whole caregiving for our poor dementia patients. Okay, so the socio-economical benefits of bilingualism are couldn't be more clear than it is. But it is still not in our mentality. I mean, not in mine because I'm doing this studies, but in the mentality of psychologists, of neurologists, of physicians in general, or the general population. Okay, and many people don't yet believe this. Okay, it's because as you see here, probably bilingualism comes always with some cultural, ethnical aspects, so it's very highly politicized. So we have to do a much stronger work in getting this really known to the big audience. The first study that actually started in this field on bilinguals was done by Gigi Luke in Toronto by then, who scanned a group of aging bilinguals with DTI. DTI means diffuse intensity imaging. It's a method with which you can measure white matter integrity, and compared the bilingual group to an age-matched group of monolinguals. And what they have found out is that bilinguals had increased white matter density in the anterior areas, in the frontal areas especially, which makes sense with the model I've showed you before, the PASA model, that elderly people would use more anterior areas for some cognitive functions. But it's important that within the elderly people, bilinguals tend to have more white matter density in the anterior areas. Now I'm presenting you some studies that I've done personally with some colleagues in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a perfect place to test bilinguals. It's like India, you find different types of bilingualism, but also a very homogeneous group of at least two distinct types of bilinguals. The typical Hong Konger is born with Cantonese, one of the two main Chinese languages, and already, like in India, from kindergarten or elementary school, you start speaking English. And use English also for superior school, high school, university, and from work. And then the interesting thing is, once you are retired, some of the bilinguals still use English for some activities, and some don't use it anymore. Okay. And the other main group of bilinguals is actually a Cantonese Mandarin bilinguals, which is actually due to the more recent immigration from mainland China. Okay, so it's even interesting if you want to study language distance. So the first study I've done in Hong Kong was to see in bilinguals only, to see where in the brain of Hong Kongers may I find the first aging effects, like where do I find brain atrophy, and if some of the demographic variables unmeasured may predict more or less aging effects in the brain. So I took the mini mental state examination, years of education, SES means social economic status, overall naming scores, because they all had to do a naming task, and the exposure to a second language. The first thing we found is that in the aging population, the most aging effects, we'll find them in the temporal pole, in this structure here, okay? Which actually makes sense, because the temporal pole is among the first two structures actually going towards brain atrophy. This is, for instance, this brain you see here is a young brain. The temporal pole is really nicely round, okay? This is someone who is 75. The roundness is not anymore there. It's all atrophy, okay? And if you now think what is the first sign of cognitive decline or aging effect, it's usually word finding difficulties. And we all know that this brain structure, the temporal pole, is one of the most crucial areas involved in word finding. Okay. So I tried to correlate all variables I had to this area to see if one of them can predict aging. None of them correlated except naming, which, as you have seen, it makes sense, because if this area is involved in naming, then the better you name, the more gray matter you should have in this area, so less aging effects you have. But the interesting fact is that if I disentangle overall naming into first language naming and second language naming, the neuroprotective effect was only provided by their performance in second language naming. Okay, so the better they were at second language naming, the less aging effects, i.e., less brain atrophy they had in this brain area. Okay, and the study, I always like to tell the story. We wrote very quickly the paper. We sent it to a very nice journal. We had only 4 reviewers. They all liked it, but they told us in order to really publish it, you need a monolingual control group, which really gave us a headache, because you will not find monolinguals in Hong Kong. You may find them, but then they have a very, very low socioeconomic status, and usually they have not any secondary school education, just 5 or 6 years of elementary school, so we cannot compare them. So we decided, let's get our monolinguals directly from Milan. Good thing is we have the same scanner in Milan like in Hong Kong, so we can just use the scanning card from Hong Kong and bring it to Milan with the same variables. We can get an age-matched aging group from Milan. We did it, and the results were actually very, very nice. Our group in Milan also showed the most aging effects in this area, but they had significantly less gray matter in this area than our bilinguals from Hong Kong. You see it here. Monolinguals from Milan, bilinguals from Hong Kong and monolinguals from Milan. Okay, and then we were able to publish this study. A year after, a very similar study came out from Canada by a group of Alan Bialystok. Again, aging bilinguals as compared to monolinguals, age matched. And you see here down, they found the same effect in the temporal pole. And in this graph, you see how gray matter density or thickness really goes down in monolinguals, and how, and this is very interesting, even more interesting than our study, it doesn't go down at all. It actually increases in the bilingual group. Okay, so really bilingualism gives you a neuroprotective effect in this brain area, which I remember is the first that goes usually towards healthy atrophy in the human brain. Interestingly, also the group of Bialystok, they created also a graph based also on some other publications in which they created an trajectory for gray matter density in the temporal pole for the aging population. Okay, and you see that for monolinguals it goes really, really linearly down, while for bilinguals it is always higher, and the decline is not so fast. Okay. So I went around for at least 6 years with my personal results, and I presented, I guess, everywhere in the world, and the comment was up till 2 or 3 years ago, very nice, but you cannot compare. We find it a little bit bizarre comparing bilinguals from Hong Kong to monolinguals to Milan. Then at a certain point, I decided, okay, I have still a collaboration in Beijing, and I know they're doing some studies on bimodal bilinguals, i.e. those bilinguals who speak spoken language and the sign language. And as far as I remember, there were many aging subjects in the group. So I asked my contacts there, let's do a gray matter density study on your bimodal bilinguals and compare them to your matched monolinguals. So the same ethnicity, same place, so we can easily compare them. And again, we find the same effects for the temporal poles, which you see here. Okay, you see it in this graph here. For the monolinguals, the density really decreases. While for bilinguals, it remains equal or increases it even a little bit, probably because they're still exposed. They use the two languages, so this area is always active, and you don't see the effects of aging. So we replicated again in this in this different population our results, and again I must tell you, we sent away this this nice work, and a reviewer told us, I guess I'm 100% sure it was Kenneth Papp, very nice, but in order to make your point, you need also a unimodal bilingual group. Okay, so you need 3 groups. And then I said, okay, enough is enough. I get my unimodals bilinguals from Hong Kong. It's the same ethnicity, okay, the same scanner, and we do a region of interest analysis with the 3 groups. And then I guess I have enough evidence, which is here. We took 3 region of interest, ROE, from the temporal pole, 1, 2, 3, and compared the aging effects among the 3 groups: bimodal bilinguals from Beijing, monolinguals from Beijing, and unimodal bilinguals from Hong Kong. And as you may see, in all these 3 regions in the temporal pole, our bilinguals, independently if they are bimodal or unimodal bilinguals, always have increased gray matter as the monolinguals. So they have more neuropotential. And as a final test, we took also another region of interest in the occipital lobe, which has nothing to do with language, and the difference, as expected, is not different between the 3 groups. I did another study with a different group of bilinguals from Hong Kong, and in this study I was interested in the inferior parietal lobules. Why was I interested in this? For 2 reasons, which you will see later. And in both regions, left and right, inferior parietal lobules, bilinguals, aging bilinguals, report increased gray matter as compared to the monolinguals. Okay. And it correlated, of course, with age and with proficiency. But then something very interesting for our linguists is that we found no effects of age of second language acquisition. Okay, in the sense that if you learn a second language before puberty or after puberty, in the aging group, it doesn't make any difference in the brain. Okay, and I have to mention that in the first study in our field, in healthy young subjects, student population, in 2004, McKelly and colleagues found an effect of second language acquisition in the same area. Now that's why it's one of the reasons why I was interested in this area here. In the sense, the earlier you learn a second language, the more gray matter you have in this area, okay? And of course, they found also correlation with language proficiency. The better your second language proficiency is, the more gray matter you have in the inferior parietal lobules, okay? But this is very, very interesting. So in young subjects, you find an effect of age of acquisition, while in elderly subjects, you don't find it anymore. Probably, and this is something important, you have to keep in mind that I guess 90% or even 95% of all our knowledge on the brain, on behavior, comes from young adults, even in linguistics, okay? And I'm sure that there's a huge difference between 2 subjects who both learned their second language at the age of 15. If I test them at the age of 21, or if I test them at the age of 71. So after having spoken for more than 60 years, the second language, okay? We don't see any more age of second language effects. But now, there was another very, very nice side effect in this study. You may see it here. Cantonese English bilinguals versus Mandarin Cantonese bilinguals. In my presentations, when I'm present and I'm online, I always ask this question to the audience. Who do you think reports increased gray matter in those areas? Cantonese English bilinguals or Mandarin Cantonese bilinguals? What is the difference? It's language distance. There's a huge language distance between Cantonese English, and there's actually little language distance between Mandarin Cantonese. Okay, many people always say Cantonese English because the language distance is huge, but it is exactly the other way around. Mandarin Cantonese bilinguals have much increased grammar in this area. And why is this? Because it's a similarity effect. It is more difficult to keep apart two similar languages, i.e., I need much more cognitive control to keep them apart. And this is actually one of the underlying mechanisms why bilinguals have increased gray matter in the brain as compared to monolinguals, because bilingual language processing heavily relies on cognitive control. Okay, in order to speak fluently in one language, I have to keep inhibited the other language. If not, it would just pop out, and my speech would be full of unwanted language interferences. Okay, sometimes this happens. We know it in our patients with small lesions in the cognitive control network. They start mixing or switching pathologically their languages. Okay, so in this case, I'm coming back now to our Mandarin Cantonese bilinguals. Because the languages are similar, it needs much more effort to keep them separated, and the effects upon the brain are much higher. Okay? But the main reason why I was interested in this area, the inferior parietal lobules, is actually this. This has nothing to do with bilingualism. This is just a scan of someone who has a mild cognitive impairment. Okay, mild cognitive impairment, remember, are those subjects who have maybe word finding difficulties or a little bit disoriented. So small cognitive impairments. Usually the mini mental state examination is between 23 and 27. I mentioned to you before that half of them usually progress towards full-blown dementia, while the other half will always remain like this. And there is a way to find out who will progress towards dementia and who will not. Okay, as usually in medicine, nothing is 100%, but this method gives you a high probability to know. Okay, if we do with our MCI patients a PET scan or a SPECT scan, and a PET scan is a tool to investigate brain metabolism, and we find this pattern here. Okay, hypometabolism in the inferior parietal lobules and the areas connecting the parietal lobes to the temporal lobes. If you find hypometabolism here, it's highly likely that this person one day will progress towards Alzheimer's disease. And this is the same area where you usually find increased gray matter for bilinguals. Okay, McKelly found it almost 20 years ago in the young population. We found it 8-9 years ago in elderly subjects, and other studies have replicated it too. Okay, so there is a link. Okay, if I have increased gray matter in this area, probably I'm better protected towards dementia onset. Okay. And again, I'm coming back to a previous slide where I was talking about the differences between cognitive reserve and neural reserve. We want to just talk a little bit about neurocompensation, also because this was actually the first study about aging and bilingualism, taking into consideration the brain. It was done by the group of Alan Bialystok in one or two main hospitals in Toronto. They took retrospectively all clinical data, neuropsychological testing from a huge cohort of dementia patients. Okay, and they kept the neuropsychological testing equal between them. and also the diagnosis of dementia onset, which should not, if I remember well, it was not more than 2 years ago. Okay, and then at the third step, they took their CT scans, the simple CT scans, and compared them. And the striking finding was that bilinguals, okay, elderly bilingual patients had much more brain lesions in the brain as compared to the monolingual Alzheimer group. Okay, despite having the same time of onset of dementia and the same cognitive profile. So the performance on the cognitive testing was the same. What does this mean? It means that despite having much more brain lesions, they work the same, i.e., they compensate better. Okay, and this is very, very important effect of bilingualism. Another way of studying this compensating mechanism is by directly employing PET technique in bilingual or monolingual Alzheimer patients, which is something we did a couple of years ago in Milan. We took 45 Alzheimer patients from South Tyrol, that northern Italian region, which is a bilingual region, and we took 45 monolingual Alzheimer patients from Milan, monolinguals. And as you see, they all had to do this PET scanning in order to study brain metabolism. And I have to repeat the slide. What you see here, it's not activity like it's activating. It is hypometabolism. So what's not anymore going on in the brain. And you see that hypometabolism is much more pronounced in bilingual Alzheimer patients. Okay. And our only inclusion criteria was that all Alzheimer patients in this study, like the study of Schweitzer and colleagues, must have a diagnosis of not more than 2 years ago. Okay. And then interesting thing again here was that on cognitive testing, despite having much more hypometabolism in the brain, our bilinguals performed better on several cognitive tests like visual spatial memory, verbal memory, and despite having increased hypometabolism in the brain. So, like the other study, more lesions. But then there was something else very, very interesting, because the age of our subjects was not an exclusion criteria, but of course we compared then the age. In average, our bilinguals, well, our bilingual Alzheimer patients were 4 to 5 years older than the monolinguals. So even this PET study has confirmed the many other cross-sectional studies, epidemiological studies that were carried out in many other countries in the world, including India. Another thing we have done in this study is to calculate a so-called bilingual index. Like you put together, you calculate the proficiency, you calculate exposure, active exposure, passive exposure, and you correlate it with brain metabolism. And the striking thing here was that the more bilingual our subjects were, the more hypometabolism they had in the brain. Okay, which underlines again that the more bilingual you are, the better you can compensate what's not anymore in your brain. Okay, and the explanation for all this, lifelong usage of 2 or more languages, okay, would technically provide you an enhancement of your executive control functions, because bilingualism heavily relies upon executive control, as I mentioned earlier. But not only, okay, executive control is parietal lobes, some frontal areas, caudate, and especially the anterior cingulate cortex, but not the temporal pole. Okay, the temporal pole has nothing to do with cognitive control. It is more an area for a semantic area for retrieval of lexical items. But in any case, enhancement of executive control and of some lexical areas on the one hand, gives you a neural reserve because of neurostructural changes in our brain, gray and white matter. Okay. On the other hand, okay, it tunes your brain, the connectivity, and one day, once we are confronting loss of neurons or loss of brain tissue, we can compensate better that loss, and the brain still works. There are many other theories. Among them, there's also one of ours, which may explain this extraordinary capacity of the bilingual brain to adapt and to this conflicting situations and all, and how what or how some structures get more tuned. Okay, I leave this slide so we can see the references. Is very, very interesting to study all of them. And the last part of my presentation, we can measure effects of aging also through some other measures we have of the brain. One of them is girification, okay, which is the degree of cortical folding, okay, and is usually calculated by this girification index, GI, okay, which represents the ratio between the superficially exposed part of the cortical sheet and the one deep inside the sulcus. Interestingly, girification has been associated. The higher the girification index is, it's associated with enhanced neurocognitive functioning across age, independently from other neurostructural indices. Okay, and it usually reflects optimized brain circuitry. Okay, so we did a huge study with all bilinguals or multilinguals we had acquired all over the world, including a group from India. Nandini Singh was so kind to give us some data from Manasar, where she was based. By then, we had different languages, different subjects, and as I mentioned, from all over the world. So we compared our bilinguals to our monolinguals on the girification index. And the interesting thing is that a preserved degree of girification exclusive to older adult bilinguals was detected in the right and coronal and thoracic cortex, which is see here, and in the structure for memory, like the right internal cortex. Okay, which has not been observed in our monolingual groups. Okay, I have finished, but I still want to mention a couple of things. Okay, the most recent findings, of course, they teach us that we should not consider bilingual and monolinguals as some categorical dichotomy. Because there are also some studies showing no effects for bilinguals. Okay, we have also to always to keep in mind that it is not enough being simply bilingual to have those effects I've shown you. We must be active bilinguals, actively exposed. We must speak the language. Okay. If we take those studies in which we compare different degrees of bilinguals, okay, of bilingualism, I have to say, we see aging, the neuroprotective effects of aging only for those bilinguals who still use their second language. Okay, it's not enough knowing very well a second language, but I don't speak it anymore, or I'm not so much exposed. I have to be an active bilingual in order to have those effects. Okay, I have finished and I'm open to all your questions.